Salutations once again, and welcome back to the Anti-Federalist Project. I am Jacob Solt, and I'm embarking on a project to disseminate my research on the Anti-Federalists. In the past two videos, I remarked on just some of the Anti-Federalist objections to the Constitution, and I contend that the most ideologically coherent of the Anti-Federalists may have their objections traced back to an assumption of a natural rights theory, which they apply to their conceptions as to the proper and legitimate role of government. In this video, I would like to attempt to demonstrate why I have come to think this all leads the Anti-Federalists into an internal contradiction of ideology. So, after I had completed much of the research on the Anti-Federalists, I still did not have a clear idea of what I wanted to say about them. That is, I was not clear as to what my thesis was actually going to be. I had read what other historians had thought about the Anti-Federalists, and I had dug into the primary sources of the Anti-Federalist writings themselves, and had gathered a lot of telling quotes and data, but the central issue binding the whole thing together wasn't altogether clear for me. I was looking for some commonality that brought it all together, or at least something that put the Federalists together, which the Anti-Federalists could be said to oppose, but the sheer diversity of opinion and use of argumentation within the primary source material was defeating this kind of unitary interpretation. I thought that many of the historians, especially Herbert Storing and Saul Cornell, had many valuable insights, but I still felt there was something that I was missing. And it was about this point, when I was looking into Madison and Hamilton's remarks regarding the Anti-Federalists, that I lit upon this quote from Hamilton. "For the absurdity must continually stare us in the face of confiding to a government the direction of the most essential national interests, without daring to trust it to the authorities which are indispensable to their proper and efficient management. Let us not attempt to reconcile contradictions, but firmly embrace a rational alternative." And it would be this statement by Hamilton that led me to question the internal ideological consistency of the Anti-Federalists. Maybe this was why things were not adding up. So I decided to pursue this line of research, and instead of looking for a, singular unitary line of reasoning, I began to pick apart the implicit ideological statements, looking for philosophical assumptions that would later come into conflict. And I began to find many promising examples. Take, for instance, this quote by Brutus. "Every government must be supported either by the people having such an attachment to it as to be ready, when called upon to support it, or by a force at the command of government to compel obedience. The latter mode destroys every idea of a free government, for the same force probably would be used to wrest from the people their constitutional liberties." So here, if my reading of Brutus is correct, Brutus is essentially making Hamilton's case that from Hamilton's view, the Anti-Federalists are indeed attempting to reconcile contradictions. However, I think the Federalists will have their own contradictions to reconcile, but I'll get into that later. And I don't want to overwhelm you with excerpts and quotations, but I want to lay the evidence out before you in order to demonstrate the direction my research has taken me. Consider this statement from none other than James Madison in 1829, speaking in a strikingly similar tone to that of the Anti-Federalist tradition. "It is sufficiently obvious that persons now and property are the two great subjects on which governments are to act, and that the rights of persons and the rights of property are the objects for the protection of which government was instituted. These rights cannot well be separated. The personal right to acquire property, which is a natural right, gives to property when acquired a right to protection as a social right. The essence of government is power, and power, lodged as it must be in human hands, will ever be liable to abuse. In monarchies, the interests and happiness of all may be sacrificed to the caprice and passions of the despot. In aristocracies, the rights and welfare of the many may be sacrificed to the pride and cupidity of a few. In republics, the great danger is that the majority may not sufficiently respect the rights of the minority." So here, Madison in 1829 is essentially expressing the very same idea of Brutus from late 1787, but with a very different conclusion. Madison recognizes the potential abuse of power, lodged as it must be in human hands, while Brutus, from late 1787, 42 years earlier, concluded that if the decrees of government be just, then the people would willingly obey them, and no force would be necessary. But if the government's decrees would be unjust, then the government must therefore compel obedience, and this would be the proof of its own illegitimacy. The Anti-Federalist, writing under the pseudonym Federal Farmer, would put it this way: I conceive for a government to be so free or so supported by voluntary consent as never to want force to compel obedience to the laws. If you happen to be falling asleep here, well then, wake up, rewind the video, because if you're not listening, this is some really radical stuff. When the issue is framed this way, it becomes clear that the issue at hand generally for the Anti-Federalists is that they agreed with the Federalists that the Articles of Confederation needed revision such that the federal government was necessary for the prosperity and security of the states. But the Anti-Federalists were not willing to imbue that government with the powers necessary to carry out those purposes. They saw nearly all the powers of government as potentially liable to abuse, and that the abuse of power is necessarily a violation of the natural rights of individuals, hence is contrary to the purposes for which governments are established in the first place. What the Anti-Federalist ideological conundrum becomes is that the means to employ government for the public ends that they desire has the necessary and corresponding result of giving to government the means of oppression. Put quite succinctly, government cannot have the power to do good without also having the means to do evil, and that republics being governed by the representatives of the majority and not of the people as the common rhetorical employment, that the majority, just as the lords of Europe, having been contracted to provide security to the people, or perhaps being usurpers from the start, the majority would slowly begin to consolidate its position, and ever creeping towards this concentration of power, and that thereby the minority would be condemned by the oppression of the majority. And this is very much in the same sentiment as attributed to George Washington by Upton St. Clair. Government is not reason, it is not eloquence, it is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. Never for a moment should it be left to irresponsible action. So then, if government is to have the power to enforce its purposes, it can do nothing without first employing force, either in explicit violence, but more generally in the threat of violence, to compel the obedience of persons to the law. And this might be satisfactory for the Anti-Federalists if there were some absolute guarantee that this same force of violence or threat thereof can only be used against people who have first initiated wrongful aggression against innocent parties, thereby protecting and not violating natural rights. But government having the force necessary to repel invasion correspondingly has the same force necessary to vanquish a legitimate rebellion against governmental tyranny. If it has the force necessary to prevent theft, then this same force can be used to enforce confiscation, legal seizure, or overburdensome taxation. While the Anti-Federalists wrestled with the contradiction of granting to government the purposes for which it could be conceived, they held back their assent to give that federal government the powers necessary for carrying them out. And I think this all stems from that strong position on the natural rights theory held by the Anti-Federalists that we saw in previous videos. And I think this is why Cecilia Kenyon in 1955 would call the Anti-Federalists men of little faith, because she would see the Federalists as having the greater faith in the integrity of the legislators and the governors to govern wisely and justly. It would be to the heart of Madison's statement and Federalist Paper number 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, then neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. And this is, if I may be so bold as to suggest, the flip side of the coin, that the Federalists, or should I say Madison and Hamilton in particular, attempt to reconcile a contradiction of their own, and it's this implicit trust in the integrity of individuals residing in the seats of power to not abuse that power. Well, that faith or trust itself really doesn't do anything to resolve the relevant ideological contradiction. It amounts to a philosophic shrug, a mere acceptance of tradition without really trying to deal with the relevant issues, like an ostrich with its head in the sand. It has the result of being a sort of absurd naivete. If the Anti-Federalists are to be charged with attempting to reconcile contradictions, as Hamilton would suggest, then I would suggest that the Federalist position is guilty of ignoring contradictions, with feeble attempts at best at reconciliation. This then is the thrust of my thesis, that both the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists had contradictions to reconcile, and it is perhaps because the Anti-Federalists make the greater effort to make that reconciliation a reality that it was remarked upon by Hamilton, and I happened to stumble upon it. But, nevertheless, it is also possible that I suffer from severe historical Stockholm syndrome, granting too much historical empathy for my subject, and I humbly invite your responses. You can contact me through this YouTube channel or provide your own YouTube video responses. As always, this is Jacob Solt on the Anti-Federalist Project, and thank you for watching.